Hi everyone, my name is Kelly Santarosa. I'm a Senior Policy Analyst with AUMA, and welcome to our webinar on policing in Alberta. I'm very pleased to have the following presenters with us today: Superintendent Mike Good and Inspector Shane Rantimal from the Operations Strategy Branch of RCMP Headquarters, K Division, and Cheryl Beck, Director, and Karen Popplestone, Manager with Contract Policing and Policing Oversight, Public Security Division of Alberta Justice and Solicitor General. So our presenters will be talking about the budgeting process for RCMP services, but in recognition of the fact that some of you may be new to your roles, we're first going to provide an overview of policing and governance in Alberta. After the presentation, we will have time for questions. I will now turn the presentation over to Cheryl.
Thank you. So the Government of Alberta, through the Ministry of Justice and Solicitor General, administers the criminal justice system and is responsible for ensuring adequate and effective policing throughout the province. And in terms of the justice system, it includes things like courts as well as the correctional facility. There's three key principles that are part of Alberta's overall policing strategy, and they are equitable policing, provincial leadership, and the appropriate civilian oversight. And I'll begin to describe what those mean. So equitable policing is policing, as you know, is becoming increasingly complex, and it's requiring specialized functions and expensive technology. All Albertans are entitled to receive high-quality police services that have adequate training, the technology, and specialized services. So the province is committed to ensuring all the communities in the province have access to policing services that they need to ensure their safety and security. And part of that is, we'll talk about that later on, is through things like grants and fine revenue that the province provides. Under provincial leadership, the province is responsible for establishing standards for both police services as well as oversight bodies, so things like leasing committees, and also ensuring that these standards are met. And they do that through audits as well as training of services and bodies, oversight bodies. In terms of civilian oversight, this is where the delicate balance between the independence and authority of law enforcement on the one hand, and their accountability to the public and civilian authority on the other, which is obviously a vital part of a democratic society. There's two main pieces of legislation that impact especially the municipal contracts. They are the Police Act. So the Police Act in Alberta defines how policing and the administration of policing operates, as well as establishing roles and responsibilities for the minister, municipalities, law enforcement agencies, as well as oversight bodies. The other piece of legislation that's pertinent to you folks on the line is the RCMP Act. So this establishes the authority to enter into the policing agreements, as well as it governs internal RCMP matters such as professional standards, conduct, and discipline. And it also talks about the Civilian Review and Complaints Commission, or the CRCC, which is the body that is responsible for oversight of the RCMP in terms of complaints. Just briefly, the roles and responsibilities. So in terms of the minister, police services and officers act under the direction of our Minister of Justice and Solicitor General. The minister also sets and enforces policing standards on what constitutes adequate and effective policing. Now, as I mentioned, the RCMP have their own legislation and have their own standards that may differ slightly from the provinces, because the RCMP, of course, is the national police service, and they must have consistency across the country. However, the provincial policing standards must still be met, and usually those are very compatible. The other part on roles and responsibilities is the municipalities. So municipalities ensure the provision of the appropriate police service in their communities, as well as the provision of the appropriate police oversight body in their communities. There's three main forms of policing in Alberta. So First Nations policing, the provincial policing, which is through the Provincial Police Service Agreement, or the MPSA, and municipal policing. So you can either have a standalone or independent police service or contract policing. And today, obviously, we're going to be focusing on contract policing. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike.
Good morning, everybody, and I'd like to say thanks for taking time out of your schedule to join us today. We'll just give you a quick overview of kind of our office. We'll talk briefly about some articles of the PPSA and MPSA, and then any questions we can address at the end. So the next slide just gives you kind of an overview of the roles and responsibilities of the Operational Strategy Branch to provide that contract oversight and support to not only the PPSA but the MPSAs as well as our office manages all the MOUs and EPAs for the RCMP in the province of Alberta. And many of you have dealt with Inspector Shane Ransomell, who's our Client Services Officer, who deals mostly with the contract partner relations portion of our business in the office. Just to give you kind of a bit of a history for some folks who may be new to the table on the contract policing model. As you can see, the current model we have now has been in Canada for just over 100 years, that the RCMP has been in the business of providing contract policing services to the various provinces across the country. It's a very large portfolio. We have, on the municipal side, I'll speak more about it later, we have over 165 municipal police service agreements across the country. What this affords us the opportunity to do is it allows the RCMP as the national police force to, in essence, address crime on 4 levels. So we can address crime at the local level, municipal level, the provincial and territorial level. We have our federal footprint in the province of Alberta, and then we're deeply involved with policing from an international perspective as well. So it affords us that kind of fluid transition across all 4 of those mediums. The next slide just gives you kind of an idea of a graphic on the contract policing scope of operations. With the exception of Quebec and Ontario, we do provide contract policing in 8 provinces and 3 territories. We have approximately 160 bilateral agreements. So those are the agreements we have with the various municipalities across the country, 44 of which we have in the province of Alberta, soon to be 45. And across the country, we have approximately 119 CTAs and 700 detachments. Within the province of Alberta, we have 113 service points in the province of Alberta, and that's broken down to our 44 MPSAs, our CTAs. We have some PPSA standalone detachments. We have our federal units, as well as we are the contract provider at the Edmonton International Airport. The next slide just basically breaks down again more, for the more seasoned folks at the table. I'm just kind of going over some stuff you've probably seen before. But just to give you an overview of the cost share of the various agreements that we do have across the country. On the municipal side, we have the municipalities who fall between 5,000 and 15,000 with a cost share ratio of a 70-30 cost share split. As per the terms of the PPSA, anything over 15,000 has a cost share of 90-10. Any new entrants are at 100%, as well as our contract commitment at the Edmonton International Airport is at 100% cost recovery. The next graphic is just to give you kind of an indication on the complexities and the details of both the Provincial Police Service Agreement and your Municipal Police Service Agreements. I'll speak in the coming slides as to kind of more of these articles of these agreements that will be more relevant to yourself without going through all of them. However, you can see the new agreement is quite detailed along with the annexes. On the PPSA side, there's 26 articles along with the annexes, which speak to things like the resources on the ground, as well as the major capital and other things like that as well. So the primary difference between the 2012 agreements, which are the ones we have now, and the previous agreement that you may have had before that, is the more detailed and structure around the areas that are noted on this slide. So the 3 things that this agreement kind of focused on, which was about 4 to 5 years to negotiate. I certainly wasn't around for the negotiation part of this agreement, but some of the people at the table were. But it was just to bring into line more structure around cost and sustainability, as well as Canada wanted to have an increased level of engagement and accountability with our contracting partners. The next slide talks about a little bit of the structure of the agreement. As you all know, the agreement itself is between the Government of Canada through Public Safety Canada and the partners. The RCMP is not a signatory to the agreements. We're just the service provider on behalf of the Government of Canada. So any administration we do of the agreement by way of billing or things that get billed out or structures in the agreement, we actually do on behalf of Public Safety Canada. We are instructed by them of how to invoice. And any disagreements, albeit might be at the onset of us when we issue an invoice, if there's any long-standing agreements such as severance, or there's a number of long-standing agreements that are addressed then directly between the partners and Public Safety Canada at the Contract Management Committee table. All the agreements across the country are structured the same, so certainly all the agreements in Alberta have the same language, as well as those in British Columbia, Prince Edward Island, wherever else we have MPSAs. So everyone gets the same, I don't want to call it a deal, but everybody gets the same kind of rules of engagements in the contract. There's no variance in the actual contract relationship between the Government of Canada and the contracting partners. British Columbia is a little more structured, or structured somewhat differently, in that in Alberta, all of the agreements with each of the municipalities in the province of Alberta are directly between the municipal government and the Government of Canada, whereas in British Columbia, they're kind of leveraged through the JSG through the Government of British Columbia. So in essence, the Government of British Columbia has an overarching agreement with Public Safety Canada, and they then subsequently have the bilateral agreements with each of their municipalities. So just structured a little bit differently out there, but other than that, the terms and conditions are identical. The next slide talks about, again, what I mentioned earlier. There's more structure and focus on cost and accountability, certainly in the 2012 version of the agreement that wasn't there, or perhaps wasn't as prevalent in the previous agreements. Just to speak to the reconciliation piece and the summary of kind of what your bills are, or what's invoiced through the agreements. And they're basically broken down primarily into three areas. You have your direct costs, which is the cost of doing business, that cover all things that it costs to have your police service in your municipality. So that's service, O&M, your property, all that support that you would need at the office itself. Then also woven in there are the indirect costs. So that's the costs that are incurred by the Government of Canada for supporting the business. So that's all your employee benefits, your pension, your EI, your national programs are in there, depot recruiting, and PDSTC, which is the dog service for those municipal partners who have their own dogs. Also, and there's accommodations. You get billed annually for your PROS footprint, as well as you also pay a fee for the CRCC, which is the oversight of the oversight body for any complaints against the RCMP. And then also in there, you also there's an invoice that's or part of your invoice is the div admin portion, which covers off all the kind of support from staffing, medical, that side of the house. That would include severance, health costs. If you have people on MATs, PATs, that all gets bundled into your div admin rate, which is billed the same across all of the contracts within the province. The next slide talks about the strengthened governance and control accountability piece of the 2012 agreement. Again, it's, a primary focus was to bring more focus on the sustainability of the costs, as well as have clear expectations and a higher level of engagement around, what the level of service was provided in your community and any changes that may be brought in as well. Basically, it came down to having a more balanced approach to the managing of the business side of the agreements, and also certainly having more accountability for the Government of Canada and the RCMP and the administration of the agreements. More from, I'll fine-tune it down a little bit to the municipal level. So for your, where that and strengthened governance and increased accountability comes into play in your municipality is, in essence, your detachment commander, be it an NCO or an officer in charge, is in essence your chief of police for your community. So with the agreement, there certainly is more expectation on our part to have increased planning around budgets and growth, and that planning should be a fluid process between yourselves and the detachment commanders, as well as there needs to be increased accountability and certainly an increased level of reporting, or certainly any questions you have with respect to billing and invoicing. We certainly expect that level of accountability and clarity is there. To sum it up quite briefly, there should be no secrets between ourselves and yourselves as to what the costs are to provide the service. I'll talk briefly about Article 2, which talks about the purpose and scope of the agreement. The new agreement, or not the new agreement, the 2012 agreement certainly talks about the duties and responsibilities of the police members in your community should be consistent with police officer duties. So this agreement spoke to that. Any duties that we were doing under the old agreement would certainly be grandfathered into the new agreement, but members should not be performing duties that are outside of that scope. And both parties agreed that, there was a transition, or there certainly should be a transition on both sides to fix that if we have instances where police officers are doing duties that they shouldn't be doing. When I say things like that, I talk about bylaws that certainly are not police function, things like garbage, unsightly yards. We should not be using our police resources to have that as part of their normal duties and responsibilities, given that most of you have bylaw officers and CPOs, which there's other better avenues to, certainly more affordable ways to have that enforcement piece done. Article 6 talks about the management of the police service, and again, that consultation around the objectives and priorities of the service for your community is key. So the CEO does set the objectives, but the objectives of the community have to be consistent with what's lined out by the provincial minister or the PPSA. So there shouldn't be any big deviation, or certainly shouldn't be any deviation from what your objectives and priorities are from municipal level to what the province or what the government of Alberta would want with us from a provincial standpoint. As Cheryl alluded to earlier, the internal management of the Municipal Police Service remains the responsibility and under the control of the Government of Canada, and that talks about some of those standards. So one of the challenges we have in being Canada's national police force is, as Cheryl alluded to, there's the provincial police standards, which the agreement says we will meet or exceed those standards. The challenge we have by being in so many different jurisdictions is that not all police standards are the same. So that's why we say we will meet the provincial standards, and in some cases we may exceed them. So an example I can give to that is a number of years ago there was a jurisdiction who, after the incident at Vancouver Airport, their provincial standard became the one, or their standard was that no police service in the province were allowed to use tasers. So the RCMP certainly said, well, that's fine for for the municipal independence within the province, but the RCMP in that jurisdiction, in that instance, still did retain the use of tasers as an intervention option. Again, going back to that national standard where in other jurisdictions that was the standard, and we wouldn't change that one in that instance to meet that particular circumstance. Article 7 talks again about the relationship between the OIC, or what I like to call your Chief of Police, and the CEO in your community. Again, the fundamental key to the agreement certainly is the consultation piece. And, we certainly like to see areas, and my experience certainly has been in the province that the municipalities, there certainly is a very high degree of consultation between our members who are in charge of those units and the various representatives from the municipality. But anything related to consultation and priorities for the community should be covered off in your APP process. So I would hope that everybody on the line is familiar with their APP process and what that consultation looks like, because that is the opportunity for the OIC or the NCOIC of your respective detachments to have that conversation around setting what those priorities are from a policing and public safety standpoint for your community, and then more importantly then how they tie into our provincial standards or our provincial priorities as well. So we sit down with the province of Alberta at a headquarters level, and we have that conversation around the APP and what that should look like, and then how we tie our efforts into the joint business plan of the province. So again, that should all filter down, and that should be kind of one big part of what that plan is locally. But again, that should be an ongoing conversation at the local level. There should be regular reporting at the municipal level. I know the agreement says that the level of consultation should be one that's agreed upon between the CEO and the OIC or NCOIC of the detachments. However, my suggestion would be that that consultation in a formal format should be taking place quarterly. That is the benchmark for us on the PPSA side. With that being said, if you want it to be monthly or if you want it to be more frequently, again, it's whatever works best for yourselves in each of your communities. The next slide talks about Article 8, resources and the organization of the agreement. Again, and Cheryl alluded to this, they have their provincial standards as to what, the footprint of any police service should look like, as well as we do from a federal perspective as well as to what our minimum level, standard level are for the number of resources that we would have at any given community. So these numbers should be agreed to upon based on your local needs in concert with our standards. We have some communities that certainly, we say your minimum is X, and they certainly have other things above X that they want, be it community resource officers, be it mental health officers. There's other things that can be added on to what we would suggest the minimum standard level is. Any growth or reduction to the footprint of the service should be signaled to us by June of the year prior to when you would like to see that increase or decrease occur. And I know many of you on the phone are very familiar with this process. So I'm going to get into the next slide and talk about Article 18 and then the importance of why we have to do that planning kind of a year in advance. So Article 17 talks about the financial planning and reporting under your Municipal Police Service Agreement. So each year, the agreement stipulates that the OIC will, on or before June 1st, provide you with a multi-year financial plan. And I'm going to turn it over to Shane for a minute because he's been managing what that multi-year financial plan process has been looking like in the province this year and to last year. So with that, I'll turn it over to Shane and he can speak to that.
Okay, thanks, Mike, and thanks everyone for joining us this morning. So Article 17 talks about the financial planning for the municipality, between the municipality and the detachment commander, and over the last couple of years that hasn't been happening. So what we did last year is we undertook to have all the municipalities over 15,000 population to begin this process. So those of you that are over 15,000, you would have seen that process, and it will continue on this year. We've already begun that process. And then this year, we're transitioning everyone else, so all the municipalities under 15,000. So in all told, this year we'll have 44 multi-year financial plans for all our municipal contracts in the province. And so with that, what happens is the commanders, we help them to draft the document, and they begin planning, looking at resources, looking at equipment, and other needs that they will require. And in essence, we have June on here, but we're shooting for May 1st this year. We will have all the multi-year financial plans signed off. So what the commanders will be doing in the next couple of months is engaging all of you, meeting with you, and discussing what's in the multi-year financial plan. So the plan itself is simply a plan. It's not a commitment or an agreement per se as to the number of resources that the commanders will be asking for, or equipment, or even monetary figures. It's simply just an agreement, or a plan that we would, if possible, would move forward with as long as funding and budgetary processes would allow for. So that's the process in a nutshell. And so when we get you to sign those off, typically they're supposed to be signed by the mayor. Once those are signed off, again, it's just agreeing to the plan, not necessarily agreeing to increasing resources or the equipment or even budget. The other piece of it is once this plan is created, it then goes to Ottawa, and Ottawa, our client group in Ottawa, will then take all those plans, put them together, and then send them forward to the Federal Treasury Board for submission. And so in essence, what they do is now Treasury Board also has an idea of what you are looking for related to increase in resources and whatnot, so that when it comes time to securing the cost share, they're well ahead in advance of planning themselves so that they're aware. So for example, let's say Rocky Mountain House would like 3 new resources next fiscal year. Then the federal government is able to now plan ahead and say, okay, we have to secure the 30% funding for Rocky Mountain House so that they can fund those 3 positions. So in a nutshell, that's what that piece is doing, is helping the Federal Treasury Board prepare for that planning piece. And so it's very critical that this planning takes place, and so that the Federal Treasury Board can get the planning done. And then when you come at the end of the year and say that you have secured the funding for those resources, that Federal Treasury Board can move forward with the minister and approve them. Have I missed anything on that, Mike?
No, and we certainly recognize that the agreement is written as such that the Treasury Board process at the federal level certainly doesn't jive well with your Treasury Board process. We recognize that you work on a calendar year. We work on a year that runs from April to March. But as Shane said, when you put it into perspective, if you go back to that slide that had the map, when we send this stuff to Contract and Aboriginal Policing in Ottawa, they basically now are putting in, they're basically putting in the hopper over 175 plans from across the country, right? Some are big, some are provincial, some are big munis, such as the Red Deers and the Wood Buffaloes, and then we have, some jurisdictions in BC that have 500-600 members. So it's important that all that growth gets tabulated on two folds, actually. One is so that we don't overextend ourselves. We know that, Depot can only produce so many cadets. We know there's certain, each year we lose a certain number of members through attrition. So we don't want to overextend ourselves too much in the sense of, we say, we're going to commit to putting another 500 Mounties on the street across the country when we know at the end of the day we can only make 300. So, we're just adding to our vacancy problem. So that's part of the process, and then more importantly is the process around the cost share. And, all in the program across the country is a $2.6 billion program. So that's when Public Safety Canada has to go to Treasury Board Canada and secure the cost share portion of the ask. Because without the cost share portion of the ask, we simply can't give you the ask. So that's all I'll say on that for now. I'll turn it back over to Cheryl, who's going to...
Mike, if I could just interrupt. I see two questions on the multi-year financial plan. Kelly, I'm going to break your rules, but I think it's important we answer them, seeing that we're there now. So Scott's asked about if this plan is known as a different name, as in the multi-year resource plan. And of course, Scott, we did that with you last year, and yes, it is. Technically, it's called the multi-year financial plan, but it might have been referred to as a multi-year resource plan. So in essence, yes, it's the same plan that we did. And Scott, you would have had that last year, I believe, your first year. And then you'll see it again this year. And Tony's question, again, yes, we are. So last year we just did the 15,000 over, but this year we're doing all the 15,000 under as well. So Tony, you'll see that this year as well in Devon.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So just to go back then to contract policing. As Mike mentioned, about the contract being between the municipality and the federal government, it being subject to provincial legislation authority, and it's also subject to provincial and federal negotiations. And a good example of that recently is the 5-year review that was conducted. So that resulted in some minor changes to wording in the agreements where things like the CRCC was occurred after the contract was signed in 2012, so the name needed to be updated for the oversight body, as well as there was some other amendments that are not making its way into the actual agreements, but are going to be addressed informally either through the companion document or agreement amongst the parties in terms of things like engagement, what that means, consultation, a dispute process, etc. So those, and Kelly will speak to that in a few slides here, are negotiations that are conducted at the Contract Management Committee meeting. So in terms of, as Mike mentioned, the level of policing is determined by the RCMP Commissioner in consultation with the CEO. Mike described how the priorities, objectives, and goals are set, and of course those also have to be consistent to the provincial priorities and goals. And they should also be set in conjunction with the policing oversight body for each municipality, in consultation, of course, with the detachment commander, to see whether there's municipality-specific goals and priorities that they want to focus on in the year. So the Contract Management Committee has representation by both Justice and Solicitor General. So our Assistant Deputy Minister and the Director of Law Enforcement, Bill Sweeney, is Alberta's representative on that committee, as well as AUMA, and that is Kelly, who is the representative there. Justice and Solicitor General also has representation on various standing committees that are part of the overall CMC. And we include AUMA in any provincial territorial discussions of a higher level. So when decisions are made regarding various items, as well as AUMA is included in the pre-brief that we do to our Assistant Deputy Minister before he attends the meetings that are held in Ottawa. And I'm going to turn it over to Kelly to further expand on what her role is at CMC.
Okay, thanks, Cheryl. So as Cheryl mentioned, I do attend the CMC meetings. They happen twice a year, typically in early May and early December. And really our role there is, it's twofold. We want to share feedback from municipalities at the PT table to bring to attention any concerns that you might be having, both positive feedback, negative feedback, things that are going well, things that you think can be improved upon. And then I come back and I pass that along to our members that contract our RCMP Policing Services. So going forward, what we're planning to do is host these post-meeting webinars so that we can tell you, update you on the meeting outcomes, things that are coming down the pipe, things that would be of interest to you as contract partners. If you have things that you want me to bring up or that you want me to share at these meetings, my contact information is on this presentation deck. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll be sending everyone a copy of the link to the recording as well as a PDF copy of the slides. So feel free to contact me at any time. If I don't have the answer, I will contact someone who does and find out for you.
Okay, and I'm going to turn it over now to Karen for the rest of the presentation.
Hi. I was just, as Cheryl mentioned earlier, the Government of Alberta just wanted to cover off what types of supports they provide for the services in addition to the policing from the actual policing that's provided. So the Government of Alberta gives municipal policing grants, for example, and police officer grants. There's fine revenues, specialized policing at no cost to municipalities that includes things like the Alberta Law Enforcement Response Teams, emergency response teams, major crime units, police service dogs, air services. There's integrated offender management initiatives, for example, that help to address priority prolific offenders, to try to address crime and get people from reoffending. There's Rural Crime Watch initiatives and grants, and they're quite involved in supporting organizations such as ACOPA. Oversight and complaint management is a big part of the supports that are provided, as well to the communities. Education and training, both for the committees and I think through a lot of collaboration that's going on different projects and initiatives. There's a host of other programs and initiatives, family violence policing initiatives, Amber Alert. There's the provincial, federal, territorial working groups that Cheryl mentioned. And then I think through Public Security Division, the Director of Law Enforcement Policy Branch, the government also develops, maintains, and manages different programs and statistical records, conduct research studies in respective offenses and enforcement practices, and really, I think, monitors and oversees the provision of policing in the province overall. So I'm just going to move on to oversight. And it was mentioned briefly earlier, but it's one of the more important aspects of policing and the manner in which it's governed. And a significant part of that is having an independent civilian body that oversees the police service on behalf of citizens, the communities, and the municipalities. And that includes involvement in the consultation processes that occur for the multi-year financial plans and for standards and priorities and those matters. Really, all municipalities should have some form of oversight body. There's either the option of the MPSA to elect to have a formal policing committee per the Police Act, or if not, you might have, and many communities do have, a citizen consultative advisory group. So these might be called a police advisory committee, a community consultative group, etc. There's a number of names for them. In some municipalities, it's the mayor. Ideally, the government and policing, we would like to see that be an independent body so that there is a separation in terms of the input coming from citizens into that process. Of course, it does flip back to the mayor to have the agreement signed off for the multi-year financial plans, but they're an important aspect of the consultation. To ensure appropriate oversight, I think that independence is significant. The committees do require support to be effective in the oversight role. So there's an aspect of funding in the in the MPSA that provides for funding and some of those grant dollars to go to the oversight committees in order to support them in their work, and that might include office space, technology, administrative support, different educational opportunities, or provincial association involvement through AAPG. The Government of Alberta also assists through this to monitor and ensure adequate and effective policing is maintained, and that's a big part of those committees' role. How public complaints against the police are handled, although under the MPSA, the oversight bodies aren't dealing with complaints directly, that's the CRCC, but they do have an interest in knowing what's going on in terms of complaints and so on, so that when they're setting priorities and objectives and goals and in consultation, that they have a better understanding of their community's own needs, and so that they can most effectively consult with and advise their council and mayor, etc. The role of policing committees then is really about setting priorities for policing in conjunction with the detachment commander. So they communicate with the municipal council and the CEO. They communicate rather the municipal council CEO's interests, communicate the public's interests and concerns, develop the yearly plan on policing priorities and strategies and consultation, and consult for the multi-year financial plans as well. And of course, it's very much of a feedback loop and a collaborative effort. They do participate in assisting and should in the selection of a detachment commander, and assist with public complaints, as mentioned earlier, to facilitate and support that process. They might appoint a public complaint director, but not necessary, and that is not a section of the Police Act that we are enforcing strictly, because it can be a challenge for many of the communities. So there is the provincial public complaint director, of course, in our office that provides many of those supports and can assist in that process. Oversight, I think, is a larger discussion, and particularly in relation to complaints, and we're more than happy to provide some training and additional support and discussion on that process if necessary. Just to touch briefly on the provincial public complaint director a little bit more as well is that role as a supportive and facilitative process. They receive complaints from the public if you do have one in place or through the provincial public complaint director. And we frequently will get inquiries into our office, and our provincial public complaint director works very closely with the RCMP in making sure that that process gets followed and following up and ensuring public confidence in that system and that the process is moving smoothly. So they do act as a liaison for the complainant in some ways. And, again, we gather complaint information and data from each police service as well in terms of being able to monitor that process. And I guess I'll turn it over to Kelly for questions.
Yeah, so if you have any questions, please go ahead and type them in to the chat box. We have lots of time left, 20 minutes if you have questions, and we'll just give you a few minutes if you want to think of them. Hi, we're back. So we have a question from Pat Vincent. Vacancies are a challenge. What is being done to address this situation?
It's Mike here. I can speak to that. So certainly you've heard over the last year or two that we certainly ramped up our troop gate at depot, or the number of cadets that we're putting in to depot to meet that increased demand, both from growth and from people leaving the organization through attrition as the last of the baby boomers kind of leave the organization. So this ties back nicely to that multi-year financial plan process in the importance of, albeit the budget cycles are out of sync a bit. That's why it's key for us to know in June, the year prior to the plan going in, as to what we can anticipate for growth, because then that allows us to control that troop gating piece at depot. So, what I can say at depot is there's no switch. It's kind of like a factory, and I liken it to an oil tanker. It takes a while to turn it around. It's a big piece of business. So even to increase the troop gate, for example, then we have to a year before we're going to increase the gate, we have to increase the number of facilitators that are there. They have to be trained in their various skill sets, be it driving, PT, firearms, that all takes probably a year ahead of time. So that's why it's key 2 years out, we can anticipate as much of the anticipated growth as possible, because it allows us to ramp that machine up. So the troop gate is going up. There's plans to keep that going. Public Safety Canada, the RCMP certainly have their eyes on what the multi-year financial plans are going to look like this year. One of the trends we're seeing from a little bit this year within the province of Alberta is the actual asks that are going into the Minister of Public Safety for growth are exceeding what the AIP letters that were going in. So, for example, we have a municipality signaling to us in the fall or December when they had their budget meetings to say, well, we're going to add 4, and then in the spring they write in and say, well, we want 6 now or 8. So that's why those extra 4 are, the earlier we can plan those in that process, the better we are to react to that. Again, we're trying to balance the needs of 170 different contracts across all those jurisdictions. So again, that's why it's key. The sooner we have that information, the more, the better position we're able to respond to that. Another thing we're doing is we're just waiting to hear back on some legislation or a legislative piece that's going on where we're looking to increase the number of reservists certainly that we can employ in the division. So we've used reservists in the past to manage soft vacancies. An example could be an attachment where the detachment commander gets hurt. It's going to be off 5 or 6 months. If we can rely on reservists to backfill that on a temporary basis, that allows us to bring an experienced member back in to provide that oversight and fill that role at the detachment level for 3 or 4 months, as opposed to trying to transfer someone in on a full-time basis, and then when the member returns back from being sick, now you've got 2 people there but only funding for 1. So we're looking at those other ways as well to kind of manage those, what we call soft vacancies across the province.
Maybe I can speak to recruiting a bit, Mike. So some of the challenges that we faced is finding more candidates and filling the hopper with more potential applicants. So what we've done is we've actually changed some of our recruiting standards to the point where if you have a university degree, you no longer have to write the entrance exam. As well, we're also enticing people to the point where if you're from Alberta, we're guaranteeing you that you can come back to Alberta. So we've changed a lot of different of our hiring practices to the point where we're trying to entice more people to come to the Mounties. So that's helping in one regard. The other thing is our commanding officer has also recognized the importance of recruiting and has made it one of his priorities in the province. So one of the things he's done is he's recognized that we don't recruit enough First Nations people from our First Nations communities. And so what we're doing is we've identified one of our members who actually does very well in working with our First Nations groups. She's First Nation herself, and she's been tasked to engage more of our communities and hiring some of those folks on those communities that would be very valuable in our organization. So we're proactively recruiting on many levels, including that area as well. So it's a challenge to find people because we're competing with other police services in the province as well as across the country. However, we're working even harder now to find more to fill the hopper and to fill depot, because now, as the federal minister says, we're approved to even up to I think it's about 50 troops.
Yeah, I think the maximum they could probably take at depot, and don't quote me on this, it's around that 48 to 50. So while that number hasn't been set in stone, I think we're going to go in this year and then around 40 troops. So again, recognizing it takes time to get that support mechanism in place by way of instructors and things like that. Any appetite to increase the troop gate certainly is being looked at.
Okay, we have another question from Tony. This question is to the province, but what is being done to come up with a sliding scale / ability to pay formula to allow all municipalities, urban and rural, and under 5,000 population to pay collectively to help defray the costs of policing at the local level? Is there any update on that?
Okay, so I can answer that. It's Cheryl Beck. So as probably many of you have heard, or maybe you were at the first meeting that occurred after this government came in, our minister acknowledged that she did recognize that there was inequity in how the funding model currently is. She has addressed it with her colleagues, but has not been given the mandate to go ahead and make the changes. This would require making changes to the legislation, so to the Police Act. And so far, there hasn't been the mandate from Cabinet to go ahead and proceed with that. We are continually receiving letters and feedback from municipalities in regards to this issue, so we're certainly alive to it at the department level as well as at the ministry level, and I would encourage those letters and that feedback to continue coming in to ensure that it is a priority for the municipalities out there. And as I said, it is recognized by our minister, but unfortunately at this time there's no mandate to proceed with any type of police costing model.
Okay, so we'll just give you guys a couple minutes to enter any other questions you might have. And while we're waiting, Mike, I was wondering if we could just sort of talk about, so in terms of, so one of the things that happens at the Contract Management Committee meetings is we get notice of new cost items that might be coming up. And so maybe we can just talk a bit about the process for how we'll be notifying municipalities about that, how that's planned, and both AUMA and the RCMP's role in discussing those new cost items.
So certainly, Kelly and I have spoken with this, and we've spoken with Cheryl as well. So given that Kelly is at the CMC table and certainly has access to the same information we do by way of what those cost items could look like, there's a document that gets produced. It's called the Contract Management Committee Matrix, or the CMC Matrix, which highlights kind of what's coming down the line. So things are put on there. It's kind of a radar, if you will, of things that could have a cost implication that's coming. So sometimes we have costs that come because of a standard that's changing or something that we're doing internally. So, but then other times we get things that are mandated, either a change in legislation or there could be a court decision that is made by which, certainly if we look back at the murders at Moncton, there were a number of things that came out of Moncton where we really don't have a choice, to mandate some of those things in. And certainly when those things are brought upon us, we'll make best efforts to have as much consultation in advance of those as possible. But in some cases, we don't have a choice to bring those standards in. So, for example, last year the decision was made nationally to bring the naloxone in for everybody across the country, as a result of the opioid crisis and our response piece to that. So that was one of those things where it was needed. It was the right thing to do. So there was, at the national level, they did have a call with the provincial and territorial partners explaining what that cost was going to look like and bring it in. And there's an instance there where there wasn't really enough time to go out and have, certainly the consultation with each and every one of the municipal police partners. However, that's something that AUMA, and I can't remember, Kelly, if you were on that call or not. I know it was brought in by the CMC table. But things like that where they're coming and there's certainly, some material or some information that would come in concert with that decision being made, we can have that brought over to AUMA to share amongst yourselves. So while we might not be able to have a call such as this to talk about it, at least then we can make best efforts to give you as much information as we can, as quickly as we can.
Great, thanks. So we don't have any other questions, so we will end the webinar now. I'd like to thank everyone for being on the line, and particularly Mike, Shane, Karen, and Cheryl for taking the time to be here today. So I just have on this slide a few more of our upcoming events. Our Spring Municipal Leaders Caucus will be March 14th to 15th in Edmonton. So if you want to register for that or for any of the other events that you see here, just visit our website on this slide, and we look forward to talking to you again at our next webinar. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.